Nurse O'Brien represents everything wrong with mid-level overreach and observe how desperation masquerades as confidence. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before 6 Marines walked through his hospital doors demanding Valkyrie by name. He had no idea what was about to happen to his career. Neither did she, yet. St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah breathed differently at night. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant frequency, a sound like 10,000 bees trapped in glass, and the linoleum floors gleamed under disinfectant so sharp it burned the sinuses. Megan O'Brien moved through the ICU like a shadow that someone forgot to turn off, her footfalls barely audible even to herself. 8 months she had worked night shift here. 8 months of staying invisible. 8 months of letting them see only a nurse, not the Master Chief Petty Officer whose credentials were buried so deep that even our encrypted files would never know her real name. Her hands moved across the vital monitors with the precision of someone who had held far worse than paperwork. The left leg compensated as she shifted weight, invisible limp, small enough that none of the day shift staff had noticed, big enough that her body remembered the shrapnel that had come so close to the femoral artery in Sadra City. 12 years ago. Another lifetime. The scar tissue at her collar caught fluorescent light when she reached for the next chart, pale and thin as a whisper, and she pulled her scrubs higher without thinking about it. Muscle memory. Always adjusting. Always hiding. Room for 47 held her attention longer than any protocol required. She had been logging the patient's visitors for 3 weeks now, every entry time, exit time, the conversations through the door when she passed at 0300 hours and the lights still burned under the gap. The notebook in her pocket, small and plain, had page after page of observation notes written in a code she knew nobody else in this hospital could break. Shorthand. Military shorthand. The kind you learned when security mattered more than sleep. She watched 447 the way a sniper watches a trigger, the way a SEAL watches an exit corridor, not because she was looking for trouble, but because trouble always knew where to find her. The tarnished challenge coin in her pocket caught the edge of her fingers as she pulled the next chart. It had been with her through 3 tours, through the building in Sadra City, through the night they pulled the specialist out of the rubble after everyone else had written him off as deceased. The coin was supposed to stay in the safe deposit box at Fifth Third Bank downtown, the one registered under the fake name. But some nights, like tonight, her hand found it anyway. Found the weight of it. Found the proof that none of this, the scroll. She was checking the 4 line on room for 43 when the fluorescent lights seemed to brighten, the way they always did when someone important entered a space. The click of expensive shoes on linoleum. The specific cadence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who could enforce it. Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived for evening rounds with his entourage trailing behind him like courtiers, 30 residents in their white coats, tablets clutched, eyes hungry for whatever knowledge or cruelty he was about to dispense. He moved through the ICU with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Not because of what he had accomplished. Because of how he expected the world to break apart for him. Megan did not look up from room for 43. She did not acknowledge the shift in temperature that came with his entrance. She kept her hands moving, kept her voice quiet, kept the rhythm of competence that never, ever invited attention. But Whitfield's eyes found her anyway. They always did. He was the kind of man who could smell defiance the way a shark could smell blood from 300 kilometers away. He stood outside room for 47, the room she had been watching for 3 weeks, and pulled the chart without bothering to ask who was monitoring the patient. His residents clustered around him, their shadows stretching across the linoleum like dark fingers. Megan moved toward the room on instinct, toward protocol, toward the simple fact that a nurse does not abandon her patient to a doctor conducting rounds, no matter who the doctor is or what kind of mood he carries in the set of his shoulders. Whitfield stepped into her path. "Not you, Nurse O'Brien," he said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that made everyone stop breathing. "Observe from the back. These residents need to see how a physician conducts triage, not how desperation masquerades as confidence." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward. 30 residents suddenly had something new to focus on. 30 pairs of eyes shifted from the patient to her. The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder. The disinfectant smell intensified, antiseptic and chemical and wrong, all at once. Megan did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not let her jaw clench in any way that Whitfield could use against her later. What she did was breathe, steady and measured, the way you breathe when you are already under fire and moving to the next position. "I understand, Dr. Whitfield," she said, and her voice was smooth as water over stone. She moved to the back of the group. She did not watch him. She watched the patient through the glass of room for 47, monitored the oxygen saturation on the bedside monitor, noted the heart rate climbing incrementally, 120 now, 122, climbing, and filed it all away in the notebook that lived in her pocket next to the challenge coin. Whitfield spent 14 minutes in room for 47. Megan counted every one of them. She had learned to count time the way other people counted money. Every second was currency that could be spent or saved or wasted. Whitfield wasted them. He explained the patient's condition to his residents with the kind of theatrical flourish that made the situation seem worse than it was. He used words like complicated and unlikely to recover meaningful function and poor surgical candidate. He did not look at the patient while he said these things. He looked at his audience. When he finally stepped out of room for 47 and moved to the next bed, Megan waited exactly 42 seconds before approaching the patient's bedside. She checked the 4 again. She adjusted the oxygen. She recorded the ascending heart rate in the chart with the kind of precision that would matter later, even if Whitfield never bothered to read it. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had done this 347 times before, though her nursing license said 8 months. The real nightmare began 20 minutes later. Megan was restocking supplies at the nurse's station when she heard the laughter. It came from beyond the medication room, near the vending machines where nobody important ever went. 2 residents. Maybe 3. Their voices were pitched low, conspiratorial, the way voices get when they think they are safe from observation. "Nurse O'Brien represents everything wrong with mid-level overreach," one of them said, and his voice had shifted into a mockery of Whitfield's precise cadence. The others laughed. The sound was the kind that made the air itself feel thin. "Desperation masquerading as confidence," another resident echoed, and then, the accent. They were imitating her accent. The way she pronounced patient, the slight stretch in her vowels, the precision in her consonants that did not match the standard Savannah drawl. They made it sound ridiculous. They made her sound stupid. Megan did not move. She did not walk toward the vending machines. She did not say a word. What she did was listen to the sound of their laughter and watch the reflection in the medication room window as Dr. Whitfield appeared at the end of the corridor, paused, and watched the residents mock her accent with the expression of a man watching something he had personally orchestrated perform exactly as designed. He did not smile. He did not laugh. What he did was nod, small and satisfied, and then he turned and walked back toward the administrative offices with the kind of stride that suggested everything was going exactly according to plan. The laughter continued for another 3 minutes. Megan went back to restocking supplies. She counted the bottles of normal saline as they went into the cabinet. 16. 17. 18. The numbers were real. The numbers did not laugh. The numbers did not lie. But that was not the worst part. The worst part came at 2,100 hours when she was reviewing charts at the nurse's station and heard Whitfield speaking with the security officer who worked the night shift, a man named Patterson, somebody's cousin, somebody who had never been asked to think very hard about anything. "Keep an eye on that one," Whitfield said, nodding toward the ICU bay where Megan had just finished checking the ventilator settings on a post-op trauma patient. "Nurse O'Brien." She started thinking she's more than what she is. That kind of thinking can compromise patient safety. I need to know if she tries anything irregular. Anything outside her scope of practice. Documentation preferred, but I'll take observations. Patterson nodded. He had the blank expression of someone following orders without the burden of understanding them. Whitfield handed him something, a business card, maybe, or a phone number, and then he walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum in the direction of the administrative wing. Megan did not look up from the chart she was reviewing. She had been trained for surveillance. She had been trained to operate while being watched. She had been trained in Baghdad, in Syria, in places where the cost of being noticed was sometimes measured in lifetimes. But what she felt in that moment, when the institutional weight of the hospital suddenly pivoted to treat her as a problem rather than a resource, was something colder and clearer than anger. It was clarity. It was focus. It was the sensation of something shifting in the water, the way everything shifts when a predator enters the ecosystem. She turned the page of the chart. She recorded the vital signs with the precision of someone documenting history. She did not speak to Patterson. She did not acknowledge that Whitfield had just weaponized hospital security against her. She simply worked, the way she had worked for 8 months, the way she had been trained to work when the stakes were absolute and the margin for error was zero. The challenge coin sat in her pocket. The weight of it against her sternum was a promise she had made to herself the day she walked into this hospital. Nobody was going to know. Nobody was going to see. She was just a nurse, and nurses do not have 12 years of combat experience. Nurses do not perform emergency procedures in the dark. Nurses do not hold colleagues together when the medevac is 40 minutes out and the only thing keeping someone alive is the application of pressure, breath, and the kind of knowledge that comes from having stood in a dump truck in Fallujah with blood on her hands and a man's life balanced on her shoulders. But nurses do see. They see everything. They see the moment when a doctor makes a mistake. They see when policy becomes an excuse. They see the machinery of institutional power grinding toward something it has no business grinding toward, and sometimes, just sometimes, they see the moment when everything is about to change. She looked at room for 47 again. The heart rate was 128 now. The oxygen saturation had dipped to 94%. The specialist in that bed did not know that the woman they had seen around the ward for 8 months was anything other than a competent night shift nurse with an accent that seemed slightly out of place. But he was about to find out what happened when 12 doctors said no and 1 person said yes. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the next shift began. The first surgeon pushed the chart across the desk without opening it. The second didn't answer his page. By afternoon, Megan had stopped counting at 12. She knew their names now. Dr. Castellano. Dr. Patel. Dr. Hawthorne. Neurosurgery declined. Thoracic declined. Vascular walked past the room like it carried a contagion. Each one examined the scans, read the note about shrapnel embedded 3 millimeters from the spinal cord, and found a reason the patient wasn't their problem. Liability. Impossibility. Non-starter. The words accumulated like sediment in a still pool. The veteran arrived by ambulance at 03 for 7 hours, unconscious from the morphine drip, his left arm a topography of scars mapping 2 tours through Helmand province. The ER attending ran ultrasound first, fluid around the heart, pressure building. His blood pressure was 78/42 and dropping. The attending called for surgery immediately. Nobody came. Not for 41 minutes. Megan watched from the medication station, her hand steady while she restocked the crash cart with epinephrine vials and central line kits. She didn't look at the patient's face. She didn't let herself calculate the odds. Master Chief training meant compartmentalizing became as natural as breathing, the mission first, emotion a luxury she'd surrendered 14 years ago in a concrete clinic outside Surgery City. The first surgeon arrived at 0 for 28, reviewed the imaging at the workstation, and shook his head like he'd seen it all before. Shrapnel's too close to the cord. Any manipulation and he becomes a paraplegic. I'm not doing that to a patient. Make him comfortable. Call the family. He was gone before Megan finished prepping the defibrillator pads. The second surgeon didn't even enter the room. He reviewed the films in the hallway and told the resident, "That's a VA case. He needs to go to the VA." His voice carried the casual dismissal of a man who'd never learned to say no properly, so he'd stopped saying anything at all. By sunrise, she had counted 12 different physicians examining his chart. 12. She wrote their names on the back of a medication label and folded it into her pocket next to the tarnished challenge coin that had been there since Baghdad. Dr. Whitfield arrived for morning rounds at 0630, stood outside the room for exactly 90 seconds, and then announced to the assembled residents that this was a non-starter. Those were his exact words, spoken with the confidence of someone who'd never had to live with the consequences of his refusal. Make the patient comfortable. Prepare family notifications. This is a learning experience in knowing our limitations. Megan stood at the four-pole, checking the medication drip rate on the patient's right arm. Her jaw muscles moved once, a fraction of a millimeter, too small for anyone to see. That was the trembling. That was the only response she allowed herself. The patient's eyes were half open now, pupils reactive to light, recognition flickering somewhere in the fog of morphine and organ failure. His tattoos told stories, a small anchor on his left wrist, a date underneath, 2011. SEAL Team 3 insignia on his right shoulder blade, visible through the hospital gown. The kind of marks that meant he'd seen Mosul, Kandahar again. She knew the insignia because she'd trained half the men who wore it. That afternoon, a grizzled EMT came by to finish paperwork, his uniform still dirt-smudged from the transport run. He was standing near the supply cabinet when Megan approached, and he caught her wrist as she passed. Not hard. Just enough to make her stop. His eyes were the color of burnt coffee, and they tracked her face with the kind of recognition that came from having seen someone under pressure when everything was burning. Baghdad, right? His voice was low, barely above a whisper. I was Army. 2012, outside Sadr City. I saw you put a sucking chest wound back together in a dump truck using sutures and a field dressing. You had blood up to your elbows. Nobody else in that convoy could move, and you just kept working like the bullets were background noise. Megan met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Her face remained utterly blank. Then she continued past him without acknowledgement, her hand still steady on the supply cart, her breathing unchanged. She didn't look back. The silence was her only response, and it carried more weight than any confirmation could have. The EMT understood. He'd met people like her before. He finished his paperwork and left without asking questions. Men who'd served learned that some things you didn't discuss in hallways where anyone could hear. Some secrets were too large to fit into words. That night, she logged into the VA database during her break, using credentials that shouldn't exist on a nurse's profile. Her hidden mission was monitoring room for 47, a different patient entirely, but this new admissions military record pulled up under her search. Master Chief Petty Officer, same unit, overlapping deployment dates. The file showed he'd been part of Operation Red Wing's secondary team, the one that went in for secondary extraction. The one that came back with half the men. She was still reading when Dr. Whitfield rounded the corner, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with the rhythm of someone who owned the hallway. He saw her at the terminal, saw her fingers moving across the keyboard, and his expression shifted like a door closing. Nurse O'Brien. His voice had teeth. You're reassigned effective immediately. Away from critical care. Away from the ICU. You'll be handling pediatrics on the 3rd floor. And you'll be supervised for any patient charting or data access. Consider this a probationary evaluation. He didn't ask why she was accessing VA records. He didn't need to. He'd been waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for the moment when her composure would slip and reveal something he could weaponize. But her face was already blank again, her hands already moving away from the keyboard, her voice already controlled when she answered. Understood, Doctor. The words came out flat, professional, drained of any inflection that might give him ammunition. This was a different kind of battlefield. Not one that required hands anymore. One that required stillness. Whitfield watched her stand, watched her clock out, watched her walk toward the stairwell without making eye contact. He'd drawn his line. He'd removed her from the arena. What he didn't understand was that removing her from one room didn't remove her from the game. Megan descended the stairs to the 2nd floor, her footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell like a countdown. Her hand brushed the challenge coin in her pocket. It was still warm from her body heat, worn smooth from 14 years of carrying it. The metal had come from a building in Sadr City, shrapnel from an IED that had killed 2 insurgents and wounded 3 Americans. She dug it out of the rubble and had it forged into this coin at a metalsmith in Camp Lejeune. It was the only piece of that year she'd kept. She pulled it out and looked at it in the stairwell light. The inscription on the back was so worn it was nearly invisible. See something. Do something. Be ready. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the patient upstairs was going to code within the next 48 hours, and when he did, there would be nobody in that ICU who understood what needed to happen. Nobody with the hands. Nobody with the training. Nobody who'd ever held someone's open chest cavity and felt a heart stop beating beneath their palms before pulling it back to life. Megan descended to the 3rd floor, where the pediatric ward hummed with the sounds of children's television and monitors tracking smaller, simpler vital signs. She clocked in at the station, accepted the shift assignment from the charge nurse, and began her rounds. Her hands were steady. Her voice was soft. She was exactly what everyone expected her to be. But in her pocket, the challenge coin felt heavier than it had in years. The pediatrics wing was quiet at 01 for 7 hours. Megan moved through the darkened corridor with the efficiency of someone who had already logged 8 months of muscle memory into this hospital's layout. Room for 47 held her actual assignment, a high-value patient recovering from Baghdad wounds, the reason her Master Chief Petty Officer credentials stayed buried so deep that even HR only saw her basic nursing license. The reason she was here. The reason she had to be invisible. But her eyes kept drifting to the monitor mounted above the nursing station. The ICU remote feed showed room 312, 3 floors down. The veteran's vitals crawled across the screen like a warning. She checked the pediatric patient first. Stable. Sleeping. The machines hummed their mechanical lullaby around his bed. Megan adjusted his full line, precision born from years of keeping soldiers alive in conditions where one trembling hand meant someone didn't go home. Her fingers were steady. They always were. In public, at least. The remote monitor showed a blood pressure of 118/71 at 0152 hours. Good. She made a note, moved to the next room, performed the routine assessments that qualified as her job. An 8-year-old with pneumonia responding to antibiotics. A teenager post-appendectomy, vital solid. Her hands moved through the rituals, taking pulses, reading monitors, documenting everything in the electronic record system that Dr. Whitfield could audit at any moment. At 0158 hours, she checked the ICU feed again during a medication pass to room for 44. The veteran's heart rate had climbed to 103. Blood pressure dropping, 112/68. Nothing alarming yet. But something was shifting. She had learned to read vital signs the way some people read lips, as though the numbers were telling her a story only she could interpret. This story was just beginning. Megan finished the medication pass at 0201. She was in room for 46 when the ICU monitoring system chimed softly at her assigned station. A single alert. Not the code blue alarm yet. Just a notification that parameters were changing. She could see the screen from her current position. Heart rhythm showed some irregularity, the ventricular pattern starting to skip like a stone across water instead of beating with purpose. She waited. Somewhere in the hospital, the attending physician would be paged. Somewhere, a senior resident would respond. That was how it worked. That was how it always worked. She returned to room for 47 and checked on her actual patient. Still sleeping. Still stable. Still the only reason she had clearance to be in this hospital at all. At 0203 hours, the monitor flatlined. Not the alarm. Not yet. Just the moment of transition. 1 second the screen showed a rhythm that was bad but fighting. The next second showed a straight line, a visual representation of catastrophic failure. Megan's eyes locked on that screen like a targeting laser. The fluorescent lights above the nursing station suddenly felt too bright, too artificial, casting everything in shades of green and white like a desert sunrise in a place where sunrises meant incoming fire. She waited for the code blue call to crackle through the intercom. Nothing came. The monitoring system sent a second alert. And a third. The rhythm remained flatline. No monitor-only arrest protocol. No announcement to assemble the code team. No voice cutting through the hospital's midnight silence saying code blue, ICU, room 312. Megan stood motionless, her hands resting on the medication cart. The tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. A first-year resident named Chen, she had seen him on rounds, nervous energy barely contained behind wire-rimmed glasses, rushed past the nursing station toward the ICU. He had been sleeping in the resident's call room. Someone had finally paged him. His white coat flapped behind him like a flag of surrender. Megan watched him disappear through the ICU doors. She called down to the ICU charge nurse. "Who's responding to the code?" The voice that came back was thin with stress. "Chen's here. He's starting compressions. I'm trying to reach the attending. The covering physician isn't answering. Dr. Whitfield isn't answering either." Megan's breath came steady. This was information. Information was actionable. "How long has he been down?" she asked. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. The patient was deteriorating all shift and nobody wanted to touch him. Too high risk. Too much liability. 12 doctors have already seen his chart. 12 said no. 12. The number landed in her chest like a bullet. 12 physicians had looked at one broken soldier and calculated that saving him wasn't worth the institutional risk. 12 doctors had chosen themselves over the patient. 12 refusals. 12 no's stacked like cordwood. Megan was already moving. She completed her documentation with movements that required no thought, her hands operating on pure procedural autopilot. Her actual patient was stable, his monitor showed nothing alarming, his fall was running clean, he was sleeping the sleep of the chemically sedated and recovering. She had 14 minutes before the next scheduled assessment would raise questions about her absence. She moved through the stairwell at a pace that wasn't quite running but covered ground like water finding its level. Her scrubs made no sound against the metal stairs. 8 months of embedding herself in this hospital meant she knew the quietest routes, the blind spots in the security camera coverage, the way light fell through the windows at different times of night. The ICU bay doors opened without resistance. Room 312 was chaos with a rhythm. Chen was performing chest compressions with the mechanical urgency of someone following an algorithm but not understanding the patient beneath his hands. He was pushing down on a man's chest with the force of desperation rather than precision. The compressions were shallow, inefficient, the kind of cardiopulmonary resuscitation that followed protocol but ignored physics. The heart monitor showed nothing. Still flat line. An ICU nurse was bagging the patient with one hand while calling reports she didn't have into the void. No attending. No senior resident. No one. Just a first-year resident and the crushing weight of a code that had already progressed too far into the darkness. Megan assessed the scene in 2 seconds. Before access was in place. The monitor showed 5 minutes without perfusion now. The veteran's pupils were already starting to dilate. Each second was a conversation between cellular death and intervention, and every second past 5 minutes made the conversation shorter. She moved to the bed and placed her hand on Chen's shoulder. "Step back." The resident looked up at her. She was wearing a pediatrics ID badge. He was wearing the confused expression of someone who had no idea why a pediatric nurse was touching him. "You need to leave. Code team is. Step back now." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in a voice that had previously sounded deferential and apologetic. The same voice that Dr. Whitfield had mocked in front of 30 residents. But something had changed in those 4 syllables. Something had shifted in the timbre and weight of it, like a weapon sliding from its holster. Chen stepped back. Megan took position at the patient's left side. She assessed his anatomy with the precision of someone who had done this before, not in simulation, not in drills, but in the field. In a dump truck in Baghdad while buildings burned and the man on her table was already being mourned. Her hands knew this. Her muscle memory knew this. Her official credentials would say she had never learned this. She had. Her hands remembered. The rib spreader was in the crash cart. She had already calculated the approach angle, the intercostal space, the approach vector. Her fingers moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had rehearsed this specific violence against the same person across multiple rotations, not in years, but in the kind of muscle memory that never really left. Combat medicine had a way of imprinting itself into bone and sinew. She positioned the needle at the fifth intercostal space. The skin resistance was immediate, then the give as the needle penetrated the intercostal muscles. She felt the subtle shift as the pericardium released its tension beneath the pressure of direct access. Time collapsed. There was no padding, no protocols being discussed, no one asking for permission. There was only the patient's anatomy and her hands and the understanding between them that had begun long before she arrived at St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah with a nursing license and a buried rank and a mission that was supposed to be about observation. She cracked his chest with a rib spreader. The sound was like opening a toolbox, a soft metallic spreading. Her fingers went into the thoracic cavity with the certainty of muscle memory, and she found the heart. It was silent. Empty. A fist-sized muscle that had stopped doing its job. Her bare hand closed around it, and she began direct cardiac massage. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The rhythm was hers now. Not Chen's algorithm. Not some textbook protocol. Her rhythm. Her understanding of the failing organ beneath her fingers. The blood that should be flowing started flowing again because she willed it to, because her hands understood the language of staying alive that most medical schools never taught. The monitor began to change. Still no organized rhythm, but the flat line became undulating, became something approaching noise instead of silence. 180 joules, she said to the ICU nurse. Push epi now. The nurse moved like she had been waiting for someone who actually knew what they were doing. The epinephrine went in. The defibrillation pads were already placed. The shock sent the veteran's body rigid for 1 second, and then the monitor changed. Sinus rhythm. Not perfect. Not even particularly strong. But a rhythm. The baseline of a heart that had decided to keep working. The spaces between the spikes became regular. The rate climbed from 30 beats per minute to 45 to 68. O2 saturation began to climb from the basement where it had been drowning, 42, then 58, then 72, then 88 and still rising. Megan kept her hand on the heart for another 30 seconds, monitoring the rhythm through her palm, through the subtle feedback that no monitor could fully convey. The veteran's color started to return. Not pink yet. But no longer the purple-gray of someone on the other side. She withdrew her hand carefully, allowing the ICU nurse to close the field. Her hand was steady. The rest of her was steady. The part of her that might have been trembling stayed locked down in the compartment where she kept such things. 9 minutes had passed. 1 minute too long, probably. But not 2 minutes too long. The math of brain damage and recovery was a calculation she had learned in the kind of training that never appeared in official hospital records. Chen was staring at her with an expression that suggested he was seeing someone he had never met before. "What's his core temperature?" she asked. 37.1, the ICU nurse said immediately. "He's warming." Are you?" The intercom crackled. "We have a code in ICU room 312. Does anyone copy?" It was Dr. Whitfield's voice. He was 9 minutes late. His phone had probably been off during his donor dinner, where decisions about hospital policy were made and money talked and people like the veteran were calculated as acceptable losses. Megan was already moving toward the door, pulling the blue gown from her body, disposing of the evidence that she had been here, that she had saved a life that 12 doctors had refused to save, that she had performed procedures her official credentials claimed she would never execute. The veteran's monitor showed a steady rhythm behind her. The rhythm that meant he had made it through the darkness and found ground on the other side. And that was the last moment before everything changed. Whitfield arrived in the ICU at 0209 hours, still in his dinner jacket, monogrammed cuffs visible beneath the blood-stained coat he'd pulled on over his shoulders. He saw her through the observation window first, Megan, wrist deep in the veteran's thoracic cavity, blood to her elbows, her hands moving with the kind of mechanical precision that belonged in a combat field hospital, not a civilian trauma bay. The first-year resident stood pressed against the wall, face the color of old bone, too stunned to move or speak. The monitor above the patient's bed displayed something it shouldn't, the rhythm. A sinus rhythm. A life. Whitfield didn't ask about the save. He turned away from the window, phone already in hand, and walked to the nearest supply closet for privacy. The fluorescent light flickered as he punched numbers, the hospital board president's emergency line, which Whitfield had memorized years ago during his rise through the administrative ranks. 3 rings. A gruff voice, sleep-heavy. "This is Whitfield. We have a massive liability situation at St. Michael's. One of our nurses just performed an unauthorized thoracotomy on a patient. No physician authorization. No credentialing. No documentation. She's operating on skills that aren't in any official record." The pause on the other end of the line was the pause of a man fully awake now, calculations running. "I'm sending a termination draft to your office in the next hour. We need to move fast on this." "Yes, I understand the liability." "Exactly." He disconnected and made a second call, this one to the VA office in Charleston, a contact he'd cultivated over 6 years of consulting work and generous donations. "I need credential verification on a Master Chief Petty Officer. Name's Megan O'Brien. She's nursing under her RN license only. I need to know if there's any other classification, any other designation, any past service that's been flagged as classified or compartmentalized. For liability purposes." His voice carried the confident tone of a man who expected doors to open when he knocked. The VA officer on the other end didn't ask why. People rarely did when Dr. Whitfield called. They answered first and thought later, because Whitfield had spent a decade making people afraid of what happened if they didn't cooperate. By 0230, he had activated his network with the efficiency of someone who understood institutional leverage the way a surgeon understands anatomy. 3 board members owed him favors from the cardiac wing fundraising campaign he'd spearheaded. The chief nursing officer wanted his recommendation for the regional health director position, a role that would triple her salary. The HR director had a sealed incident in her file that Whitfield knew about and had never mentioned, a courtesy that created a debt. Within 4 hours, the pieces moved into position like surgical instruments clicking into place. The chief nursing officer found Megan at 0601, as the sun bled orange across the parking lot and the night shift was transitioning to day crew. She held a manila envelope, standard hospital issue, sealed with the administrative emblem. Her voice was professional, measured, the tone of someone delivering a difficult but necessary decision. "This is your termination notice. Effective immediately. Practicing beyond scope without authorization. You'll need to surrender your credentials, and we're requesting a full investigation into your previous 8 months of assigned duties." She didn't meet Megan's eyes. She didn't have to. The decision was made at levels above her pay grade. Whitfield arrived within minutes, walking beside Megan as she moved toward the locker room, not escorting her, not exactly, but standing close enough that every staff member understood the message. He waited outside the locker room door, leaning against the frame with the casual confidence of a man who'd just won. Inside, Megan removed her scrubs in the dim light of the changing area, the rows of metal lockers around her like a cell block. Her hands were steady. Not shaking. Not trembling. Hands that had just compressed a human heart and brought it back from the edge of death, hands that had carried wounded soldiers through Baghdad's streets under fire. Those hands folded her scrubs with hospital corners, the precise fold of military discipline, and placed them carefully in the laundry bin marked for biohazard contamination. The tarnished challenge coin came free from her pocket as she bent to place the final fold of fabric. It had been in her pocket for 8 months, a small weight, a constant whisper of who she was underneath the scrubs and the deference and the careful invisibility. The coin slipped from her fingers and hit the tile floor. It rang against the hard surface, a clear, metallic tone that echoed in the empty locker room like a bell tolling for everything about to be lost. The coin spun twice and came to rest, the emblem facing upward. A Navy SEAL trident, worn smooth by years of being carried in combat zones, in tactical operation centers, in the pockets of people who understood that some prices couldn't be calculated in money or titles. She left the coin there. She left the locker room in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a grey sweater, her face the kind of blank that isn't empty but full of something held so carefully it resembles nothing at all. Whitfield stepped aside as she passed, already composing the email he would send to his network, already planning the statement he would release about protecting hospital standards and the dangers of scope creep. He'd defeated the woman who'd challenged his authority. He'd used the system the way it was designed to be used, from the top down, with all the weight of institutional gravity on his side. The victory felt clean and definitive. He had no idea what was moving toward him from the north. The coin was still spinning on the tile floor when the sound came, boots on linoleum, synchronized, the distinctive rhythm of disciplined movement. Not hospital staff. Not emergency response. Something else. Something military. 6 Marines in dress blue uniforms entered through the St. Michael's main entrance at 0632, moving in formation with the kind of purpose that made people step aside instinctively. Their shoes echoed against the floor like a countdown. The lead gunnery sergeant's voice cut through the morning bustle of the hospital wake-up, loud enough to stop conversations mid-word, clear enough to carry authority that had nothing to do with hospital hierarchy. "We're looking for Valkyrie. Megan O'Brien. Where is she?" The coin was still spinning when boots echoed in the hallway. 6 Marines in dress uniform entered the hospital lobby simultaneously, their synchronized march making the tile floor ring like a bell tolling. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, their bearing the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The lead gunnery sergeant stepped forward into the cluster of staff and visitors, his voice cutting through the ambient beep of monitors and the whisper of overhead pages. "Valkyrie," he announced, loud enough to stop every conversation in the hospital. Loud enough that the cardiac monitor in the distance seemed to pause mid-beat. Loud enough that a coffee cup froze halfway to someone's mouth. The hospital security guard, the grizzled EMT who had transported the Special Forces veteran, the one who had whispered "Baghdad, right?" during that gurney transfer weeks ago, stepped forward with a shaking voice. His hands trembled as he spoke, but his words carried the weight of 16 years of service. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, son. Navy Special Warfare Group." The words hung in the air like oxygen before decompression. The security guard had just spoken her true identity aloud in a hospital lobby crowded with physicians, nurses, administrators, and patients. The name came out not as a question but as a statement of fact, the kind of institutional acknowledgement that cannot be unsaid or forgotten. Megan stood motionless, jaw muscles the only betrayal as the Marines turned toward her. 30 seconds later, the front entrance doors slid open again. A 2-star admiral in dress blues walked through the automatic threshold, his movements economical and deliberate. He carried a tablet and wore the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. The crowd instinctively parted. He began reading from the screen without preamble, his voice steady as a surgical laser. 3 tours Baghdad. 14 combat rescues. Silver Star. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Trained more SEALs in tactical medicine than anyone alive. He paused, allowing each medal to settle into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "This is Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, United States Navy. She was terminated by this institution for saving a life that 12 physicians refused to touch." The number hung there. 12. It wasn't a statistic anymore, it was a condemnation. 12 doctors. 12 refusals. 12 men and women in white coats who had walked away and let a nurse in scrubs choose heroism over protocol. At that moment, the ICU resident pushing the veteran's wheelchair entered the elevator foyer. The patient was still oxygen-dependent, still recovering, but he was alive and mobile in ways that should have been medically impossible. His legs were strapped with bracing equipment, his chest still wrapped in surgical bandages, but his eyes were clear. He raised one hand, gesturing for his wheelchair to stop. The oxygen hissed through his cannula as he spoke, his voice rough from intubation but steady. "She took a building in Sadra City to pull me out after everyone said I was already gone," the veteran said into the silence. "That was 11 years ago. And she just did it again, here, in this hospital, on this night shift." He paused, his breath catching slightly. "She did it when I was supposed to be gone. When the system said I was already gone." Nobody moved. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like static on a dead frequency. What happened next didn't unfold in real time. The video someone had filmed, the same video that captured Dr. Whitfield's grand rounds humiliation, his mid-level overreached lecture, his casual dismissal of a nurse he didn't recognize, that video surfaced within an hour. It appeared on Reddit first, then spilled across every medical forum and military social media platform like water through a cracked dam. By noon, it had 4 million views. The comments section became a confessional, former residents describing Whitfield's cruelty, nurses documenting 15 years of institutional bullying, patients from his private practice recounting his arrogance like it was a checklist. By evening, an email appeared in hospital administrator inboxes. It came from Dr. Catherine Jong, a cardiothoracic surgeon at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, the physician who had personally trained Marcus Whitfield 2 decades earlier. The message was brief and devastating. "I am horrified to learn that a physician I trained has so thoroughly abandoned the values of our profession. Effective immediately, I sever all professional ties and withdraw my recommendation from his credentials file." That single email triggered everything. The hospital board convened an emergency session at 2,100 hours. 3 board members that Whitfield believed were in his debt received 10,000 emails each from veterans organizations, active duty military chapters, and nurses' unions. His fundraising leverage, the donor network he had cultivated for 15 years, evaporated like water under heat. When donors saw active duty Marines providing testimony about his behavior, providing statements about how his institutional cruelty had created an environment hostile to life-saving medicine, the checks stopped coming. The chief nursing officer, calculating the new political winds with the precision of a sailor reading a shifting tide, produced documentation of 12 previous complaints against Whitfield, all buried in HR files, all sealed with non-disclosure agreements he had enforced. The HR director, facing federal scrutiny, revealed that Whitfield had personally pressured him to flag Megan's file months ago, before the Special Forces veteran even arrived, before there was any reason to target her except that she was competent and he was afraid of competence. His network collapsed like a building demolished from the inside. Each domino fell and triggered the next. His medical license entered review status. St. Michael's terminated his contract to limit institutional liability. His wife, a cardiologist with her own reputation to protect, filed for separation, citing professional embarrassment. Applications to other hospitals went unanswered. His name had become toxic, the kind of professional liability that no institution would voluntarily assume. 6 months later, a nurse rotating through community service for her final clinical hours found him in a basement classroom at Coastal Georgia Technical College. The room smelled like old linoleum and cleaning solution, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sick institutional glow. Whitfield wore a cheap polo shirt with the college logo embroidered over his heart. He was teaching basic life support to community college students, 18 of them, paying $18 an hour for a CPR certification they could have gotten online. He stood over a rubber training dummy and began demonstrating chest compressions. His hands shook visibly as he counted, 1, 2, 3, 4. The compressions were technically correct, but there was no confidence in them. A student asked if he was okay. He didn't answer, just kept counting, his jaw working silently. His credential badge read, Instructor, Basic Life Support. That was all that was left, the infrastructure of teaching without the authority to lead, the appearance of medical expertise without the institutional power. Back in Savannah, on a day when the Atlantic wind carried salt and memory, Megan stood in dress whites at the Veterans Medal ceremony. The uniform hung on her like it had been waiting for this moment, like the months of disguise had been only rehearsal for this reveal. The Admiral presented her with a service commendation, his voice echoing across the outdoor pavilion where hundreds gathered to witness what the system had tried to hide. The Special Forces veteran stood from his wheelchair with leg braces, a triumph no physician had predicted, and saluted her properly, the way warriors greet warriors. His hands were steady. His eyes were clear. The oxygen equipment was long gone. The EMT who had recognized her in the hallway stood in the audience, tears streaming down his weathered face. The resident who had mocked her accent stood in the back, holding a letter of apology she would never read. The tarnished challenge coin from Baghdad, the one that had rung against the hospital tile floor like a bell tolling, was now polished to mirror brightness. It sat mounted in a presentation case alongside the veterans' medals, catching the Savannah sunlight like a promise kept. The light reflected off it in sharp, clean angles, illuminating the scratches and dents earned in a desert halfway around the world. That coin had been buried under scrubs and disguise and deference. Now it caught the sun and refused to hide. Megan allowed herself the smallest smile as she stood with the veteran and the 6 Marines. The first emotion she had shown in public through the entire ordeal. The mask had held for 8 months, through humiliation and isolation and termination. Now, in this moment, the mask dissolved like it had never existed at all. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever kept quiet while injustice happened around you, subscribe to this channel. Like this video and tell us in the comments, what would you do if you held a secret that could change everything? Because heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs. Sometimes carrying coins that catch the light just right. Sometimes they're the quietest person in the room.